And how's it going in Dubbo, Mathew Dickerson?
Yeah, going well. Thanks, Chris. Our case numbers are stabilising somewhat. And, I dream that sometime this decade I'll be able to get out of my house again.
Oh, people are really waiting, hanging out for that moment, aren't they? Now, let's talk about passwords first up. Microsoft wants us to ditch the passwords. How can this possibly work?
It makes no sense at all, does it? How can we survive in this modern world without a password? We keep being told that we've got to have more complicated passwords, we've got to have different characters in them, keep changing them regularly, and of course people don't. People just go back to the old 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or the classic old password of password. But Microsoft is saying, well, it's all too hard. We've been trying for all these years to get it right. We still haven't got it right. There is still an incredible number of attacks, password attacks every second, 579 per second around the world, password attacks or breaches on people's accounts. So they've actually said, let's give up on it. Let's give up on the password altogether. And I first started reading this story and I looked at the date to see if it was April 1st. How can we do away with a password? But they've got a few concepts that they're working on. And this is actually something you can do right now. You can change your Microsoft accounts right now, Chris, to take advantage of this. So if you go in and turn off passwords, before you do that, you've got to download an authenticator app. And so if you turn off your password, then if you try to log into something like Outlook or try to log into Windows, instead of actually typing in a password, it will then trigger a code to be sent to your authenticator app. So then you pull out your phone, there's the code that I would need to put in, type that code in, and that's effectively your password, but the password changes on an ongoing basis. Now, some people mightn't like the authenticator app idea, so you can actually do other things. You can have a code sent to your phone. You can actually use some biometrics, so fingerprint or face scan or iris scan. But keep in mind, this is not two-factor authentication where you have a password and something else. And this is not a password fail-safe where if you can't get your facial recognition to work, you can go back to your password. There is no password on this. So if you're using biometrics, for example, if you're using a fingerprint scan or a face scan, I had a guy the other day whose fingerprint did not work because he'd been using some super glue. And of course that filled in the grooves in his finger. So if something like that happens, then you're stuck. You can't get into your account without having whatever method you choose. So it's the brave that might go forward at the moment and use it. And you're also relying on the fact if you're using something like an authenticator app that you've got reception all the time to get that code to come through to your phone. But it's the lesser of two evils, I think. Microsoft are saying this is better than having all those password attacks.
And are you tired of plugging in your charger? Why not just sit your phone on your desk where X marks the spot? Ikea can add built-in wireless charging to almost any table.
We've seen a little bit of wireless charging in furniture. You can go and buy desks, you can go and buy shelving now that's got wireless charging built in, and that's pretty exciting. But lots of us already got desks. We don't need to go and replace our desk. So we've been looking for a solution. Now, one of the solutions in the past is to take your wireless charging pad, route out a hole underneath your desk so you end up with a very thin piece of timber or even Laminex just at that point where the charger is. You install it in there and hope no one leans on that part of the table, otherwise they'd go straight through. Ikea have come up with something a little bit different. Most wireless chargers, you need to sit the phone directly on top of the actual charger for it to be effective. This new wireless charger makes sure that the actual sweet spot for charging is between 8mm and 23mm above the actual charging device. So the idea there is with double-sided tape, you stick it on the bottom of a desk, and assuming your desk is no less than 8mm and no more than 23mm, then the wireless charging will work on top of the desk. So then you can look pretty groovy. You can just come along and sit your phone on a certain spot. You might put a little dot there or a little X there, and you sit your phone there and it just magically starts charging. What have we come to in society, Chris? This is where we're at. We no longer, not only is it not good enough to not plug in a charger to your phone, we don't even want to walk over and sit it on top of a charging brick. We just want to be able to sit it on our desk and charge up from there.
Yeah, and the latest EV model to hit our shores is the Hyundai Ioniq 5. Did I get that right?
Ioniq 5, yeah, that's right. Yeah, Hyundai have had a few models. They've had a previous Ioniq. They've also had a Kona, and they've been going okay. And they've been models that have been more or less traditional cars in the Hyundai range where they've converted them over to be an EV. The Ioniq 5 is the first one that they've actually built from the ground up as an EV, and that's a huge advantage because you actually change the way you build a car when you're building it from the ground up. So this, I think, is going to be a pretty good competitor in the Australian landscape. Now, it's still a bit pricey. It's still just over $71,000. That's above any of the cash incentives, unfortunately. New South Wales, Victoria, you need to keep it under $69,000 to get that $3,000 cash back. So it's just missing out on some of those. So maybe they'll bring it down a little bit just to take advantage of some of those cashback programs. But it's got pretty reasonable specifications. It's sort of probably trying to compete with the Model Y Tesla, which hasn't hit our shores yet, but the Model 3 Tesla is at similar sort of price, maybe a little bit dearer than the Hyundai. But again, it's something that people are looking for alternatives. They'd like alternatives to be a bit cheaper, to be honest, but this here is probably something that's not a bad alternative. Small SUV, reasonable range, reasonable performance, reasonable battery size. It's all not too bad. It's not going to smash down Tesla stats, but again, it's not quite as expensive as a Tesla. So I can see this being a reasonable sort of car that's coming to the market. But again, it's all about more competition, more choices for buyers, and I think we'll go forward and see more of these cars on our road soon.
And Matthew, how do you get high-speed internet across a raging river when the land-based approach is a 400-kilometre round trip? Use lasers, right?
Use lasers. It's always cool to use lasers, Chris. There was a great quote from Edison when something happened when he was trying to get a battery right. This is Thomas Edison. When he was trying to get a battery right, there was 10,000 ways that he tried to get a battery built. And someone interviewing him one day said, "You've had 10,000 failures." And he said, no, I've just found 10,000 ways that haven't worked yet. And it's similar for this particular one. Google's parent company Alphabet has been working on trying to get some internet access to some areas where there isn't internet access at the moment. So they tried some helium balloons and that didn't work out quite so well. They tried some solar-powered aeroplanes that would go up, unmanned aeroplanes that would go around and fly for weeks or even a month or two at a time, and that didn't work out so well. So they shut down what was called Project Loon, and people said, oh, look, it's a failure from Alphabet. It hasn't been any good. One of the technologies they worked on with Project Loon was laser-developed transmission of internet access from a point, i.e. a helium balloon up in the air, down to the ground. So that same technology they're now starting to use to get ground communications. In this particular example here in the Congo, there is a raging river between two particular towns that are only a few kilometres apart. To try and get an underwater cable between those two is near impossible because the river's running so fast you can't just drop it down the bottom of the water like you do in the ocean, and to try and bury it underneath that is just too expensive. So they've now set up a laser from one side of the river to the other side of the river, and the river's not 5 kilometres apart, but this laser transmission goes 5 kilometres, and they've been testing it at speeds at up to 20 gigabits per second. Normally with any sort of wireless communication, you're getting nowhere near that sort of speed. But these lasers are able to get this sort of speed. Over the last 20 days, they've transmitted 700 terabytes of data just testing it out. It works really well as long as you don't have fog. So if you had somewhere like a San Francisco, for example, that's very foggy, it wouldn't work so well. But in somewhere like the Congo, not a lot of fog around, usually pretty clear air conditions. This is where these sort of lasers are going to be fantastic. So again, they start off at 5 kilometres, they'll start to expand that, and you'll get these faster internet communications by using these laser connections. So Project Loon wasn't a complete waste of time. Out of it, we've got these laser internet connections.
And this is also interesting. Forget the idea of a COVID-19 test that detects the presence of the virus. This new COVID-19 test aims to detect a person's immunity to virus and potential future variants.
It is a really interesting one because one of the arguments from people that have had COVID-19 is they don't want to get the vaccination because they've already got the antibodies built up in their system. Now, whether they have or they haven't, no one really knows for sure at this stage. But this test they're developing at the moment does a few things. First of all, it tests the effectiveness of the vaccine. So you've had the vaccine, we've had the second shot, everyone sits there and goes, well, I think I'm okay, I've had 2 shots, but you don't really know whether your body's built up the antibodies against COVID-19. You're just hoping the vaccine's okay, and we know the vaccine's not 100% effective. Same for someone that's had COVID-19. They've obviously got some antibodies. They've survived it. But do they have enough? Do they have as many as the vaccine? So this new test will be much more pleasant than a COVID-19 test. You're not having something stuck so far up your nose that it feels like it's coming out the back of your head. It's just a finger prick test. And then from that finger prick, you'll actually see the blood, and the blood sample will be shown to basically have a certain number of antibodies. And if that concentration of antibodies is high enough, then you know that you're fairly safe against COVID-19 because your body has got the antibodies built up. The other part it will be really useful for is when we look at some variants. And I was speaking to some doctors last night about exactly this. When they talk about a booster shot in Australia, they might be talking about that the end of this year, maybe next year, maybe March next year, for example. Do you need the booster shot? What variants do you need it against? Well, this is where this sort of test will actually give you more information about what your body's already got, and then either say you don't need a booster at all, or you've got these particular antibodies, but there's some other antibodies you need. So here we'll tailor a new vaccine to suit just what your body needs. So it's getting a bit cleverer as we're going through this whole pandemic. We're working at lots of different ways to attack it. It's getting a bit cleverer in what we're doing with it.
Now let's finish on a story from NASA. NASA is on target to launch their new telescope into space in December this year.
Yeah, this is really exciting. People in NASA have been working on this telescope almost since the Hubble was put up in the sky. Now, the Hubble has been fantastic. Some of the images we've seen from the Hubble have been fantastic. What most people don't realise is that the Hubble actually isn't that far above us. We're talking a few hundred kilometres above us. What the Hubble's really trying to do is get away from our atmosphere and then take images, shots, take photographs from outside our atmosphere so they can get a much clearer view. And some of the things we've been finding with the Hubble telescope have been fantastic. The next version of that is called the James Webb telescope, and that launches, as you said, in December this year. That will be 1.6 million kilometres above the Earth, or away from the Earth. So get away from the atmosphere, get further out into space, and this will be able to see right back to almost the Big Bang. Almost the first light that we saw in the universe will be able to be seen by this particular telescope. So it's pretty exciting. They've had some real challenges. One of the things is that some of the light that's actually going to hit it won't be visible light. It will be infrared light. So they're relying on the heat from things that are happening billions of light years away. So they have to keep this particular telescope incredibly cold. We're talking minus 263 degrees Celsius. So in the testing for this, they've had to actually take it down to those temperatures, put it in an atmosphere that's been very little atmosphere, because obviously 1.6 million kilometres away, there's not a lot of atmosphere, and then do a lot of their testing around that sort of environment. Even sending commands to it to make it change what it's doing. When you send a command 1.6 million kilometres away, it takes 6 seconds just for it to reach that particular area. The mirror in this is 6 metres wide, so you've got this huge mirror there. It's some fantastic technology that's being put into the James Webb telescope. From our perspective, it'll be probably the middle of next year before we'll see the first images. There'll be about a 6-month calibration process, but I'm pretty excited about what we'll be able to see from the James Webb telescope.
And you can catch Mathew Dickerson and Tech Talk on YouTube. And, of course, mate, you've got the podcast.
Podcast is going very well, and it's great to have your support out there in 2Web land. Thanks, Chris.
We will talk again next week. Thanks for the information this morning, mate.
Thanks, Chris.